Hi, Lisa. Can you hear me?
I can. Thanks, Nis. And yeah, if your guests are with us, go ahead.
I'm hoping that the guests are here. I just want to do a quick check-in to see which donors are here. Fatima is here from Wraith, and we're expecting Toko from... Hi, Fatima.
Yes, and hi, everybody. Listen here.
Yeah, great to see you, Fatima. And I'm hoping Toko is also here from Andrick Bull Foundation. So Fatima, the good news is it's just going to be you and us. Hi, Jason.
I'm not sure that's good news for me, but I'm happy to be.
Yeah. Look, to the group that's here today, we invited a whole range of donors, many donors, all the big donors that we work with on a regular basis. But unfortunately, most of them couldn't make it. But we are glad to have Fatima here. And we hope that if the other donors join us during the course of this conversation, it'll be fantastic. And then Lisa would also just alert me to say that we've got the other donors that are here. Okay, so with that, I think I'm going to get on with it. And so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the probably the graveyard shift of the PILG gathering. It's been an interesting 2 days. I couldn't attend all the sessions, but those that I attended were absolutely amazing. And I attended the last one now with the GBV, which generated a lot of discussion with the group. So this session, we are looking at the role of donors, and in this case, it's the Wraith Foundation in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of funding for public interest law work. I think given the fact that we've only got one donor that will engage with us, I'm going to lean on my colleagues from the Social Justice and PILG group to engage further on funding, donor plans, and so forth. So just a few words from me as the facilitator of this session before we get started on this crucial conversation is that every civil society organization, I think we all know it, have been affected by the economic impact of the global health crisis. Despite these challenges, civil society organizations, including all the ones that are present here today, missions remain vital, and demand for programs and services did not necessarily decrease during the pandemic or the health crisis. In fact, in many cases, as in the organization that I work in, the demand has actually increased radically. So if you look at the discussions that took place this morning with Tepo, Imbuzeni, and others, that the role of civil societies remains vital in our country, and is much needed during this time of the pandemic. But these organizations can only deliver. We had wonderful input this morning and yesterday and this afternoon. But these organizations can only deliver on that work if we get the necessary funding. And if that funding is not there, we can't actually move because we don't get funding from anywhere else except the donors. So it is in this context that we host this conversation. Today, I'm hoping the other donors will still join us later on, focusing on the transformation of the social justice sector. We've had lots of conversations around that, and it'll be interesting to see where we can go with that concept. We also want to look at sustainability of organizations. This morning, we looked at the sustainability of state-owned entities and government organizations, but what about the NGO sector? And people often don't realize that of the three sectors, public, private, and civil society, the civil society sector is the most powerful, and people don't realize it. But the only way they can make that impact is through the funding. We'll also be looking at, hopefully, on some funding models, and we'll have an open discussion with what organizations or challenges of what organizations face. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Fatima, and then we'll open it up to everybody. Okay, so we've got Toko that will join in a minute. And once Toko will go after Fatima, and then we've got a special guest at around 4:30, which is about an hour's time of Ayabonga Kawe. And hopefully we'll manage to run the conversation for an hour before he joins us. Fatima, over to you.
Thank you, Nelson, and thank you, Paul, colleagues and comrades, for giving us the space to help think through some very important concepts of our sector. So I think I'm glad to be here. I brought some backup, so Ayabonga is going to follow on some of the ideas that I present with the study that we commissioned, that he undertook for us. And Jason Brickhill is also here, who will be running the PILG review for Wraith. And I'll speak a little bit to that later. But just on the COVID moment, Nelson, to start there, I think the COVID moment, more than any other moment we have lived through, the age category that I'm in, has laid bare the fault lines, not only of our country, our region, and the world, and more than ever emphasized the need and the importance for the work that we do. And so what I wanted to do is, the invitation that I received, the brief was about speaking about transformation, transparency, and then funding to the PILG sector. So let me start with transformation. I think the first thing is that in the Wraith approach, we talk about transformation in every monitoring meeting. I think many of the other PILGs who are on here will know that this is an ongoing conversation and concern on our part. What is clear from those conversations is that as a sector, we don't have a clear understanding of what we mean by transformation. So there isn't a shared understanding of what transformation means. That's number one. The second part is we definitely don't have a shared understanding of why it matters. And by and large, is the very superficial understanding of transformation as the optics of the organizational leader. So we think that transformation is about replacing whatever leaders we had historically with black leaders, and particularly black women. Now, for me, I think that the optics matter. It matters to have numbers in place, but the fact that at this stage represents the sum total of our vision for transformation of our sector shows the limitations of our conversation and our thinking. So for me, in a South African context, politically, we must locate the conversation of transformation as the fact that it's about power and the concentration of power, the historical concentration of power in a minority of people. And so at the heart of our social justice work is about recognizing who bears the brunt of the social justice fallout in our country. And by and large, that's black working class women. So I think it's very important for us not to theorize about what that means in our country in social justice terms, and that for us to really comprehend what that means and for us to advance agendas that actually make sense, it's important that we have that democratic in our organizations and in our leadership spaces. And I think the COVID moment was important for another reason. I think as organizations, we've all grappled with the issues of race, gender, and to a lesser extent, class in the NGO sector. And what COVID did through the Zoom functionality, it brought the realities of our colleagues into our lives. You cannot deny talking to someone when they're sitting in Soweto or in a rural area and they don't have cell phone access, that there is divisions and there's privileges amongst us as well. So again, for me, while I think the sum total can't be about who leads the organizations, I do think that matters. We need a critical mass of black leaders and black women leaders in particular to begin the transformation journey, but that can't be it. So the heart of it is about how we transform our organizational cultures to reflect the vision and the values of our organization. So the political work that we're pursuing in the world out there can't be separated from what we look like and the values that we live out in our organizations. And for us, this is why transformation is important. If you haven't read the sector review report yet, there's quite an interesting chapter on transformation. It's one of the longer chapters in the report. So I advise that you read it because it speaks to the complexity of this conversation. But I do think practically what we need as a starting point of the conversation is to better conceptualize politically what transformation means, because if we don't have that, we're going to engage in this very superficial process of changing organizational leaders, things that we've derived once a Black woman leads the organization, and then I think we're very disappointed when we find out that that is not the case. So on the right part, in terms of funding practice, as I've told you, we keep an eye on it. It matters to us. It's a very active conversation, and in some cases, a very uncomfortable conversation with organizations. It's very clear that often organizations who are led by white directors are uncomfortable with the conversation. So I want to reflect personally as well on my experience in monitoring meetings. That often in organizations that are white-led or where the management teams are white-dominated, white people who lead the organizations will not dominate the entire monitoring conversation until it comes to transformation. Then it's almost a queuing in of Black people. Mandla will talk about transformation. Sipokazi will tell us. No? And that kind of power dynamic is so visible in the organization. In these meetings, there's a discomfort about owning that it's a conversation about all of us and for all of us. And I think the last point about transformation is to note that it matters in terms of our impact in the world. The people that we are trying to influence by and large through our social justice agenda is the leaders of business, of government, and increasingly we're training our focus on business. And there's a question about the legitimacy of our sector, because people are calling us out on the fact that we're speaking on behalf of communities and we don't look like those communities. And I'm not saying that you have to be from a community to speak for a community, but there was a time in the history of the social justice sector where it was very obvious that there was a disconnect between who we claim to be speaking for, working for, and who we were as a collective. I'm very happy that that has changed, and I think we must acknowledge in the PILG collective that there's been significant advance in this regard. That at this stage, I think the majority of PILG leaders are Black women. My own background was in the land rights sector, where I think this was achieved probably a decade ago, where there was that kind of leadership transformation, but that sector is still grappling with transformation broadly because we didn't have that political conversation. So that is, I'm going to pause there on transformation, and I think we can come back to that. Now on funding, obviously as a donor, this is our preoccupation. This is what we breathe and dream about. And it's very clear, I think, that we are heading for a crisis in the sector. There's lots of uncertainty. So the first point to note is that most funders are invested. Their funds are in the markets. No? It's invested in stock markets. And so when this global crisis plays itself out in very tangible terms, the crisis rolls out in terms of the funding available to donors and the kinds of money that donors can.
Yeah, I'll be back. Okay, I'm going to get Kate. I'll be back.
Disperse. Okay, I'm going to proceed. And so I think it's important that we realize the reality of where funders are located. We've grappled with the issue of PILOs and PILO funding for quite some time. You will see if you look at our list of grantees, which is on our website. So right there on our website, we list all the organizations we fund and the amounts we fund them for, which is not a standard donor practice, but one which we think is important. So we fund most of the PILOs because we believe that public interest litigation is an important social justice strategy. And politically, in a context where many of the other state institutions haven't held the line, increasingly we've seen that it is that last recourse of access to the courts that have held together many key constitutional values that we've held dear. Whether that's an effective long-term strategy is another conversation. I'm not sure if we'll have time, but at this stage in our history, it certainly is important, at least to prevent the erosion of further rights in our country. And so for that reason, the right remains invested in it. What I do think we must flag, and on occasion I'll say when I'm speaking for Wraith and when I'm having a personal reflection, is the fact that the PILG collective is quite a privileged collective. So if we look at how money is distributed throughout the social justice sector, this room receives the lion's share of most donors' money. whether it's RAID, OSF, Ford Constitutionalism Fund. So I hope that part of the funding conversation is the conversation about the collective privilege of this room and the unhappiness of other parts of the sector on the fact that this room has occupied so much or cornered so much of the resources, and also how you use that position of privilege. And I know that the PILG sector is also feeling the pinch. But for example, if you look at that sector review report, again, the conversation on funding, the PILG collective is mentioned specifically, and specifically from social movements. You know, the fact that this is the kind of the sector that struggle. And I know that in the work of the PILG organizations that we fund, that there's increasingly a closer movement towards partnering with PILG, with social movements in a more meaningful way. And I think that's an exciting and a relatively new development. If you look at the work of PILG organizations in the past, there was sporadic engagement with movements and often quite superficial partnership. When I look at the work now, there's a deepening of thinking about how you do that meaningfully in a way that doesn't instrumentalize movements or working class people or make them objects of a campaign that you run, but meaningfully build the struggles of working class communities through partnership and litigation. I think that's new and that's exciting, and it's a methodology that we need to continue exploring. So to help us understand as RAID what's happening in the PILG sector, what is likely to happen going forward, we have commissioned, and this is why I reference Jason, to lead us in making sense of what's happening in the PILG sector. So what Jason will be doing for us, with you, is he will be engaging individual PILG organizations to help us all reflect and better understand what the models are of, especially funding models within the organizations. What are the strategies? What are the challenges organizations are grappling with? And that is because I think all of you will know, most of you are great grantees, that RAID has a defined lifespan. So it will close its doors in 15 years from now, 1937. And so it does mean that because we've got that clear horizon, it gives us the privilege of working backwards and asking ourselves what it is we want to do in the remaining lifespan of our existence. So historically, we've funded organizations with grants, we've invested in organizations individually. But in the last 15 years, what we want to do is we also want to concentrate our investment in the sector sustainability, which is not synonymous with individual organizational sustainability. Because the reality is we can build one or 3 or 4 very strong organizations, but in terms of the magnitude of our social justice ambition and dream and what is required of our country, that's not going to cut it. What we need is a strengthened sector. And so part of what we've started doing through the sector review is looking at the sector in an ecosystem lens, seeing what we need collectively, how we work together, how do we play off each other to build a strengthened sector. So RAID has historically done sustainability work, sustainability support, but what we're doing is we're concentrating those efforts and hope to have a much more strategic approach to that. We've also created a position to lead specifically that work. And if you know RAID and the RAID structure, we're a very small office. The fact that the board has agreed to that post is an indicator of how serious we are to really focus on sustainability and capacity building work going forward. So Jason will be doing that. If we need more information from him, Jason can speak about the PILG review. And maybe the last thing, and Ayabonga will be here shortly to talk about it himself, is one of the other things we did is because we wanted to understand what's happening with money in the sector, and because we knew no one actually knows. When we talk to each other, it's all anecdotal observations of where we think the money is concentrated, who's lost out on money. We commissioned the funding flow study, which gave us some indicator of what has happened over the last 20 years. I think it was very interesting. One of the main challenges with the study is the availability of data and the link with transparency and donors. So even organizations, fellow donors that we consider to be comrades and fraternal donors, we sit in rooms often together. We struggle to find the data on that. And so I data does sound like a technicality. It doesn't sound very political, but who's funding who? And the duplication of funding to a certain set of organizations is very important because, in my view, the concentration of resources in a few organizations is antithetical to the idea of social justice. At the heart of social justice is an equity of power, and the fact that all of the donors are funding a few organizations, and I think, honestly speaking, many of the organizations in this room is problematic. So part of what we need to do is how we develop a more equitable approach to funding without undermining the sustainability of organizations who are currently resourced or well-resourced. I don't know if anybody would acknowledge that they are, but the funding flow study is very important. It really was exploratory. I think it provided some indicators. It's something that we're going to have to follow up on because it's very clear that there are key developments in our sector. I've been in monitoring meetings for the last week. Every organization that I've spoken to have expressed anxiety about the future of money, and I think that is a legitimate anxiety. It's real, and so because of our classification as a middle income country, many of the international donors have left. I think USAID have announced that they're finishing off the last of their PEPFAR money, so that important TB work will be unfunded as of next year. So the international donors have left, the EU, USAID, and so on. The social justice donors are there, but that's a shrinking pool. And so the challenge to us is to acknowledge the fact that there's no new money coming from those sources. And we have to be quite creative about either looking for alternative sources within our country, because that's what international donors are telling us. You're a middle income country, there's enough resources in that country to fund the work of social justice sector. What you have to do is to be creative about finding it. And so obviously this forces us to talk about the conversation about the corporate sector and its money to us. So in the funding flow studies, and Ayabonga will talk to it, there is a significant amount of money coming from corporate South Africa to non-profit organizations, but they don't want to fund social justice work. And I think it's important that we understand politically why this is so. The corporate sector in South Africa, if you take mining, is probably the most clear example, is they derive their profits from the existing model. They don't have an interest in a disruption to that model. In this room sits everybody, a group of people who think actually this model doesn't work for the majority of people in this country. We need to change it. And so a lot of the mining and extractive rights is about a contestation of the mining model. So I think we must understand realistically that they're not going to fund their own demise or a challenge to their profits. And there's also the question of how us accepting corporate money compromises our ability to take on the very companies that we are targeting for money. So I think there are creative ways of getting around it, and we shouldn't write it off. We've seen that in the Zuma must fall moment, there was an increase of money to the social justice organizations, which I think is a tacit admission on the part of corporate South Africa that they need the social justice sector. So they might not share our human rights agenda, but they understand that the politically stable country is what they need for their businesses to operate, to thrive, and so on. And I think, again, in the Zondo period, we saw something similar. So I think there's a basis for engagement. What we have to figure out what that model would look like practically. And then the last aspect of kind of building a sustainable sector is to explore ways of working together in ways that would save us costs. There's lots of duplication between organizations. And when Ayabonga speaks, he's given some more thought to the notion of shared services in the sector. What are the things that we can share between each other that doesn't undermine our work or our effectiveness, but in some way cuts the costs that we do? So a very practical example that I've been thinking about, that we've been thinking about, is the idea of getting, how do you get accounting firm? Why do we not get accounting firms to do all our audits without us paying for it? It's a significant cost. Organizations are spending up to 100,000 a year on audits. If you add up, there's 200,000 registered NGOs with the Department of Social Development, and that's an underestimation of how many organizations there are in the country. But if you multiply that with what we're paying in audits, not asking accountancy firms to give us money, but to give us the service at no cost would be a significant subsidy to the sector. The same is true for thinking creatively on how we take on the cell phone companies. It's a significant budget line for all of us, especially in the context of COVID, where we've had to move online, where we've not only had to provide data for our staff, but also started working online and engaging our communities. So it's both a political project because we know there is a problem with cell phone companies and the rates we are paying, but it's also a pragmatic project that could well introduce a significant resource stream or resource saving in our context. Nelson, I think I've gone way more than my 5 minutes, and Toko is here. So let me pause for now, and then I'm happy to take the conversation forward after that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fatima. I mean, it's just fascinating listening to you, and I'm sure we could listen to you the whole afternoon about the insights and how you're tying in money with the work that needs to be done in so many different spheres. So, but I'm sure it's also going to generate a lot of conversations once Toko speaks. Toko, I hope I can see you. Yeah, there you are, Toko. Toko, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks
so much, Nelson. Thanks.
Right. Good to meet you.
Yeah. And just like Fatima, I also have backup on the webinar, well, the meeting, so I'll also call on my colleagues from the Heinrich Böll Foundation to give input. I'm going to go with a slideshow, mainly to help me with my notes and my thinking. I will need some help, Nelson, with time.
Toko, we can go on a bit because we've only had 2 downers here.
Sure. Yeah. Just let me know when you think I should wrap up.
We're expecting Ayabonga at about 4:30. So we may want to have maybe 10-15 minutes, and then or maybe 10 minutes, and then we can open it up for a discussion with the colleagues here.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'll keep an eye out.
Thanks. So thanks so much for inviting the foundation to come and speak. And I mean, I always appreciate an opportunity to be able to be in the room with other colleagues who are supporting the work that you're doing on the ground, or supporting or complementing the work that you're doing with organizations as well. So to take up the challenge of answering the questions that were posed, it was really nice, because it turns out that many of the questions that we are asking ourselves are the questions you are asking of us. So at least I can say we are searching for what good enough funding looks like. And I thought it was important, just very quickly, to really echo what has been said about the impact of COVID-19 and around the invisibilized lives and missing voices, or voices that aren't given the space. And in some ways, this platform provides people access that they weren't necessarily able to enter in some of the meetings that I've been able to participate in. But also, like Fatima was saying, it can also exclude people. And so, you know, when thinking about, one of the questions was sort of, how are we as the donors or funders looking at the current environment? And so I wanted to just sort of go with the angle of how we've approached it by looking at what is happening. We're seeing a global system that's in polycrisis, multiple challenges, climate-related disasters, growing inequality, debilitating and often violent identity politics, which is increasing, and closing civic space. And so Southern Africa, because the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we work in Zimbabwe, Namibia, and South Africa, is no exception. And I think, importantly, something that really kind of stands out strongly was around the civic space ratings report, showing that we are all under pressure in different ways and to different extents. And I think the PILG program has shown what are the different battles that we are fighting, if it's around climate change or around vaccine work, whatever it might be. So the protest and activism, even under COVID-19, continued. We saw continued demands for better working conditions, food, basic services, social protection, protection and action against gender-based violence. But we also saw that this was dispersed by force. So again, as much as communities and the communities and organizations and activists that you're working with on the ground are experiencing state responses to a crisis, there was this continued push, which was very important to note. And I think it's important to also show that these were similar trends in West Africa, Europe, Central Asia, Latin America. So this is a global phenomenon, and it's being experienced in different ways and different combinations, but there's nothing unique about what we are experiencing. There is something about the global economy and our polycrises that requires us as activists, social justice engagers to be looking at. So we know that this had a particular effect on Black women, and it exacerbated pre-existing gender inequalities in terms of employment and unpaid care work. And so we've also seen enormous and powerful literature coming out, both feminist and decolonial, on development and notions of development and the donor community that have contributed substantially to scholarship on alternative development models and alternative conversations that need to be had. And so I really loved this recommendation from the report that Wraith commissioned, just to kind of capture that. So where do we fit in? So for us as Heinrich Böll, we feel fundamentally the push and pull of localization. So even within Heinrich Böll, we're a big family, and we have partner projects in around 60 countries. And we also have regional foundations in Germany itself. And so, I thought it was important to situate what kind of a player we are, for those of you that are not familiar with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And we have what we refer to as a back donor, which is the BMZ, or the development, the German Development Corporation. And they have a new strategy, a 2030 reform strategy. And I've quoted it: "We are calling on our partner countries, of which South Africa is one, more than before to provide evidence of progress made on good governance, human rights, and fighting corruption. The key to development is for partners to act on their own," and partners here they're talking about countries, "is to act on their own initiative. We are forging reform partnerships with countries that are particularly reform-minded and providing them with extra support." So that's kind of who's behind the work that we as a political foundation affiliated to the Green Party has to navigate. So in a very quick snapshot, because I know Ayabonga is going to tell you all about the South African funding picture, Germany spent about 28.4 billion on total official development assistance in 2020, of which about 11.6% goes to civil society and business groups and institutions. And the Sustainable Development Policy focuses on increasing economic growth as measured by GDP, rather than challenging missionary and colonial legacies of extractivism and inequality. So the German government has yet to publicly state that it recognizes that development cooperation overall continues to be influenced by colonial thinking and knowledge production. So part of our role as a foundation is to push back and to say, we've got to start looking at what our partners are doing, what the activists we're working with on the ground are saying, and how they are experiencing us in country as a partner. So part of one of the recommendations that came through in this critique, I said, what are some of the critiques, is that they felt that in cooperation with civil society, that those receiving funding from the BMZ should develop markers for tracking other forms of inequality, for example, racial inequality, and also make foreign policy feminist. So decolonize development cooperation, orientate development focus from poverty reduction towards eradicating inequalities, and strengthen support towards a feminist civil society. So, you know, the work that we focus on really, you know, we have to take into consideration both that push and pull, as I've spoken about it. So what did our partners say? So we did a very quick little feedback of partners and actually non-partners as well, around how did they cope, how did they find dealing with COVID-19. And we got some very powerful feedback that would enable us to think more creatively and critically about the ways in which we manage this push and pull that we experience relative to kind of the objectives that we have for our work. And so it was really useful for us to be able, in preparing for our strategy, because we've just come through we're preparing for our next 3-year cycle. And so in our strategy development, to be able to start reflecting on what our partners have said, and how can we, given the kind of framework that we work under, to be able to deliver on that. And what was very useful is that we were able to maneuver very quickly to be able to provide data and to be able to enable partners to shift and change where they needed to. If more equipment was needed, we were able to provide that support. But that doesn't necessarily tell you about that longer horizon of what Fatima was talking about in terms of sustainability, which is important. I've just thrown this in. I don't have time to go into detail, but essentially one of the things we are required to track and report against is how we meet our projects and the work that we fund and support, where it sits in relation to our gender kind of responsive or gender categorization. So you saw previously that one of the critiques was that there isn't a requirement to have other indicators. So, you know, like to bring in other kinds of indicators that could show what does transformation look like. So we don't have to report against that yet. That might change, but we do have to report against gender, which is interesting. And so part of the Southern Africa office in the work that we're doing, I sit in a forum called the Gender Focal Points, is that I've said we actually need to complement this now. If we're going to take into consideration the South African, Southern African context, the questions that Ray, that Ford, around transformation, how do we define it? How do we understand it? How does a German foundation make sense of needing to pay attention to class, race, language in the countries that we are present? So at the moment, this is kind of one of the things that I can show you relative to gender. So one of the questions that I was asked for the brief was kind of how has the current context informed and shaped the Cape Town office? And this is just some highlights. The ways in which we've tried to reflect on what our partners have said to us, recognizing the poly crisis And so this is sort of our dream of what our next cycle will look like at the end of the 3 years. And that begins to be important around, can we feed this back? Can we provide support to our partners and activists and our our networks? Are we able to provide feminist leadership, solidarity? Are we able to initiate opportunities for new Black women leaders in the social justice sector to be able to get the support they need? Are we paying attention to that? How are we showing up in relation to the work that we're looking at and what we've learned? So ideally, we want to create more possibilities, both within the foundation. So important conversations, I can tell you, are taking place within the foundation, which is very exciting from a continental perspective, but also within our regional office. We are having these conversations about what does it mean to talk about democracy if we're not supporting civil society, social justice movements to be able to be intra-democratic. What does that look like? Are we modeling the best mechanisms for providing support financially to organizations? Are there other ways that we can have conversations about reporting and engagement? So these things become absolutely critical. And especially the well-being component as well. Are we able to provide an opportunity for organizations and activists to take stock of what they're experiencing, to have time out and those, so that the care, belonging, and respect is at the center of our work rather than domination, subordination, and violence. So this is how we think we can do this. So the money flows in ways, in two ways in the German Foundation system. We can fund directly a partner organization, or we can fund research work, or we can do the work ourselves. We're a political foundation. So we are both, I think it's often the term, players and funders. And so it can be very complicated and complex and gets very messy. But at the same time, I think it brings an opportunity for us to have these hard and difficult conversations that Fatima is saying. They are hard, it is difficult. And to be able to say, are we funding in ways that are perpetuating a particular type of politics, or are we actually shifting and developing new ways of working and thinking? So I think that's very important. So this, I just wanted to show you an example of kind of how we are working we're trying to work across our programs. So we have the 4 programs here. And each of us has a common task relative to food. So even though it's human rights and gender justice, and there are partners here, is there opportunities? What does it mean when you're looking at community kitchens and gender-based violence? Are we asking those questions? Are we making those connections? And are our partners asking us to make those connections? And are we responsive when they ask us about that? So TB, it's interesting that you brought up TB, Fatima, because it's come up for me now 3 times, TB. And for me, that then means that this becomes an important issue. And I know the dots are connecting around TB and the withdrawal of funding, and then the sort of COVID-19. So as much as you've asked me some tough questions around, kind of, are we, what is informing and shaping our thinking, which was the question, and I hope I've provided you an answer of how we've gone about it. It's interesting, and I loved the question as well around sort of what can be done, right? And in some ways, there's 2 things that I wanted to throw out, some provocations. And this is partly HBF and partly Togo. So my colleagues might be horrified to see this. But one of the things that we found, and I found over time that is important, is that we are fighting the alt-right. So in order to respond, what would have been traditionally left or progressive organizations are being pushed into the right, which means that the kinds of questions being asked around our funding are very different from what they would have been 5 years ago, for example. And so we need as much help to be able to push back and say, actually, no, it's COVID-19 and it's TB. You know, it's debt relief and green recovery and social protection. And so these kinds of conversations become absolutely critical, and as important for us to come to you and say, look, we're under pressure to change the ways in which we fund. We know that it makes sense to do 5-year unrestricted funding. We cannot do that. We have a cash-based system. We can only fund on a year rotating system. But is that enough? Should we be accepting that, right? How can we push?
I can connect.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks,
that's all.
Toko.
Yeah, that's, yeah. And so those were just some of the thoughts.
Yeah, but thank you so much for giving us, I think, the global strokes of how HBS or HBF actually works, and the possibilities that we have as organizations in this country. So what I'm going to do now is open it up to the floor, to the colleagues to engage with both of you, but also among each other. And I'm sure that there have been some questions already in the chat, but I'm not going to read them out. I'm just going to open it up to everybody. Okay. You can just put up your hand and go for it. Anyone? So we've got about 10, 15 minutes before Ayabonga comes on here. So it'll be great if we can just use this time to engage around that. There was a question from Robin earlier, or a comment from Robin, if I'm not mistaken. Robin, you want to just raise that? I'm just trying to find it in the chat.
100% sure. But hi, Nursing. Thanks for that. Yeah, my comment was really just, I think we all grapple so much with this issue of how do we make our organization sustainable. And, yes, you know, it's a question, obviously, we're always asked by donors. It's a question we grapple with ourselves because, you know, essentially we are 100%, or, you know, as close to 100% as possible, reliant on donor funds. So I really would appreciate some insight from donors who obviously also think a lot about this. What do we do as organizations to decrease our dependency on donor funding, if that is what donors mean by sustainability, or what are some ideas from donors around how we can be more sustainable?
Thanks, Robin. Shall we just take that for now, and the other colleagues can join in? Fatima, you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a shot. First of all, I can't believe this room is so quiet and so shy.
Yes.
I know you've got lots to say about donors, transformation and transparency. And the reason why I know it is because I've been in conversations with you. So I think it's very important because a lot of the things that we need to talk about, Nelson, the conversations are happening on the sidelines. And yes, the significance of this PILG conversation is that I think it's a useful, formal starting point of engaging around these. So, Robin, I think you're right. The notion of being completely financially independent is not a viable one for NGOs. By definition, the way people stay sustainable is they have an income and they generate some kind of income and they expend all of that. And the reality is that the enterprise of income generation will detract from the ability of NGOs to do what they are supposed to do. So I do think it's not possible for NGOs and for civil society organizations to live without income, donor income in particular. What I do want to challenge you on is to lead the conception of sustainability by the sector. Donors have a lot of power. We each will have our own idea of what could contribute to long-term sustainability, but I really think the conversation is about you. And part of the challenge here has been the lack of vision that comes out of the sector. I hope that doesn't sound too critical, but I do think there must be, you must lead the conversation, Robin. I don't know if it's been conversation in EE on how you make your organization more sustainable in the long term. And my view of it is that a part of that conversation is financial, but not all of it. Because sustainability is not only about how we manage our fiscal resources, it's also about the effectiveness of the organization and the methodologies we employ towards that. So interestingly, I think that conversation links back to our partnerships with movements, which is something Lisa flagged in there. So I do think politically, there's a limitation to how radical NGOs can be. And it's not a view, it's an historical fact. If we look back in the history of, not only South Africa, the history of humankind, moments of radical social change are movement-led. It's the people who are directly affected by oppression who get angry enough to say we have had enough and we're overthrowing the system. So think about the end of slavery, think about the end of colonialism, think about the end of apartheid. Apartheid is the one that we've lived through recently. And so the issue is about how, and it's not that there isn't a place for NGOs, and we've seen the effectiveness of NGOs in a post-apartheid South Africa in terms of holding that line in a context where the state has, for all intents and purposes, started falling apart and has been hollowed out significantly. So it is about how we also, in sustainability terms, make the connections in meaningful ways that there isn't an exercise of power with the people for whom we claim to be speaking and struggling on behalf of them. So for me, a big part of sustainability is that relationship as well. So Lisa, an emphatic no for pressurizing movements to develop systems like NGOs. Again, we don't have to look very far in our country, look back 20 years and look at the movements that have tried to go in that direction. It's killed them. So we don't want movements to develop a kind of NGO infrastructure. We want movements to be organic, to be on the ground, to be focused on the community, to be made up of the people for whom the struggles are waged, and to find creative ways around accessing resources. My most recent experience of a creative model around that is Makua, the Mining Affected Communities United in Action. So if you look at what they've done, they've pragmatically recognized the fact that you need an audit to get the money. You need a kind of the board, the formal structure. You need to be registered as a public benefit organization. But do you really want to traumatize a movement of working class people by forcing them to do that and by placing money, the millions that they need, at the center of an organization and not think that it's going to unravel a movement in some way? Obviously, it's not possible. We can look at the South African landscape to see the, a landscape of exploded civil society, social movements. So what they have done, which is I think a new experiment, is they've created an NGO alongside an NGO that is effectively houses all the corporate functions of what an NGO, what a movement needs to secure resources. I think it's a very new model. They're not that old, but it would be interesting to see, because I think in the South African context, we have not had great success with funding movements without the money entering into struggle, bedeviling and undermining movements. So the initiative that you're involved in the Small Fund for CBOs, is also, I think, a very important new initiative. We've got to look at ways of how we put the resources and power at the center of working class movements in our country, because as NGOs, we can only take struggles this far.
Thanks, Fatima. Thanks so much for that response. I'm just going to take one more comment from Shiham. Ayabonga is here. So I'm going to just hand over to Shiham and then we'll move to Ayabonga. Shiham, and a possible response,
Yeah, thank you. No, I listen, this is just, we have been speaking about, broader funding, which is like Moyo Foundations, etc. But I also wanted us to speak about the fundings broadly from the private sector, which we are not even touching. And broadly, the public interest sector are working and in terms of ensuring that there's a rights-based framework and it's implemented etc. I mean, those are things that we are doing. We are also creating an enabling, a broad, safe, etc. environment for the private sector. And I don't know how is it that we need to be able to leverage that, not from a point of handout, but from a point of that we are the ones that is also, you know, there's our work is a major stake, or there's a major stake of our work in their work, because we are creating also that social environment, whether or not it's in relation to violence, whether or not it's in range of rights. And we're not having that conversation. It's one thing to speak about OSF, constitutional fund, rate, etc. We need to be able to speak about the private philanthropy foundations in advancing also broadly race and gender transformation of public interest legal organizations. And we're not having that conversation. We're not. It's premised that there's a lack of transformation, but we need to be able to understand how does that impact on the private sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Yam. So before I move to Ayabonga, I just want to say something, that this is the tip of the iceberg of a broader conversation that we need to have within the sector, and all the points that are being raised, from Toko to Fatima to Siam to Robin to other people that are put in the chat. And I want to recommend that we need to actually have a separate session just on this, and possibly ensure that more funders, donors within the CSI groups and others to come together to start unpacking this of what we are trying to achieve. We've listened to so much of the discussions in the last 2 days of what we want to do as a sector. But we need, again, I'm going to reiterate, we need that funding. But if we don't have that conversation collectively, I mean, I have an idea that I've spoken to various donors and within the social justice group, is forming a network, absolutely forming a network and doing work collectively, something that Fatima alluded to, something that Toko alluded to, if you work collectively, your impact is bigger without diluting your individual work that you're trying to do. So I'm going to stop there. Fatima, I'm not sure if you want to introduce Ayabonga before we go.
Yeah,
That'll be good.
maybe just to say a few concluding words on my part before I introduce Ayabonga. The one thing is, because we recognize the rate has a 67 million rand a year funding budget, it's very small compared to what the sector, what the money in the sector is. So we recognize it, but we also recognize our power as a donor and our seat at the table in relation to other funding spaces. So we've been very active in leading the convening of the social justice donors to engage on a regular basis on these and other questions, and have been active in another space, the PASA space, which is the most that corporate money. I must confess, in the PASA space, it's very difficult. The construct of social justice is not easily understood, and by and large, the corporate funders are more interested in funding the manifestations of the dysfunction than they are to fund the structural drivers thereof. So that's essentially the difference between social justice donors. When you come to us and say people are hungry, we want to know what are you going to do, what is driving the hunger crisis in our country, and how can we change that. Whereas corporate donors are by and large interested in feeding the hungry. That's kind of a simplified version of it. But so there has to be, I want to encourage the move towards a formal engagement between the sector and the donors, and Ray would be happy to convene that for you with the social justice donors. But Nurse and I would encourage the collective to think through clearly what the issues are, because I can hear in this conversation we're just beginning to, think aloud together, and I think that's important. But I think when it comes to that conversation, it's really important that we have, because the number of issues that we could possibly engage on is endless. No? The funding crisis is that complex. So I think it's important that the sector thinks through the priorities, because if you don't, the donors at the end, because of our power that we have, by virtue of coming to the table with money, will in the end craft the agenda. So I do think own your power as well, own the moment, and do the kind of preliminary thinking in coming to that table. And if you, contact us, I'll be happy to set that up with Audrey.
Thank you so much,
Shall
Fatima.
I introduce Ayabonga just to say
Yes.
that a part of our sustainability vision is to produce research that's of use to organizations as well. So when we think about things, so the sector review came about because the RAID wanted to review its own strategy, but also realized that as a donor, you don't change your strategy in isolation of the context. You want to have a clear lens on what's happened in the post-apartheid era in South Africa. And we could have very easily paid a consultant to do it, but we drew in sector leaders and had the leaders guide and lead the study. So the sector review wasn't a RAID study, it was a RAID supported initiative. And the idea is that in as much as we've got the money to commission the research that we need to make decisions, we also want these products to have the dual function of being useful to the sector itself, to inform strategy, to inform resource mobilization and so on. And this is exactly what Ayabonga has done for us. He's helped us because we were curious. When we talk to organizations, there are theories and suspicions about what has happened to money. Where money is coming from, who it's gone, who's lost money, who's gained money. And we thought it's an important moment to actually take stock of where we are. And Ayabonga will talk to the difficulty in getting to the information. And so what I think we have at the moment is not an accurate picture. It doesn't have all the detail, and if you're a statistician and you look at the report, you may have questions. No, but it's all about the limitations in which the study was done. I do think it's an important starting point, and now that this study has been finalized, we partnered with Alma with it. Now that they have signed up on it, we will make it available, and I do encourage you to engage that study very carefully, because I think it's an important starting point now that we have a better idea of what's actually going on. I think it places us all in a position to more concretely strategize about what needs to happen in relation to funding. I think Ayabonga Kawe is well known in the sector. He's a development economist and also media personality. Let me make a pitch for him. He's got a show on Metro FM. You really should be listening to him. And I think I will hand over to Ayabonga to talk about the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Fatima, and thank you very much, Comrade Nessan. And I already see, I guess, in the group of participants, I must say maybe two sets of comrades. One, comrades I've worked with in the sector over the last while, and also many of those who've contributed to the study. So it's a real pleasure, I guess, to have the opportunity just to share, some of the work that we've done with Wraith and Alma. And I think there's a story even in the limitations of the study, because it's a story certainly for the sector more broadly to also, do some introspection and to look inward, because a lot of the things that we agitate for are sometimes seen as external to our organizations. And I think this was a big opportunity to really get a sense from many organizations, of what they're willing to share in some cases and what they're not willing to share. And I think some organizations were really straightforward. I mean, they were like, yeah, we're not going to give you that information. Whereas some were very generous with that information. But I also think what is important was that, many of the organizations had also been taking this issue of transparency quite seriously in sharing critical pieces of financial information on their websites. And I want to thank a lot of those organizations, because they've certainly made a lot of what I'm going to present and a lot of our work very, very much easier. So let me share my screen just briefly. Just give me a second while I get, let's do that. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So let's do that. Okay, cool. So as I said, this study, I guess, was an outcome of a terms of reference we were given, which was really to look at, the path of funding flows in the post-apartheid period to organizations that we would ideally characterize as social justice organizations. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole, a report, because I would encourage comrades to go and read the report. But I think for me, what is important is really some of, the information that's come through that is of interest to public interest litigation organizations and organizations that are working in the arena of legal aid as part of a subset within the broader social justice sector. But of course, it's difficult to do this analysis if we don't analyze the evolution that has happened in financial flows that have gone to the social justice sector. And in the report, we try and categorize this in three related era. The first era is really, I guess, the first phase, of the very, I guess, euphoric mood after 1994, but also, I guess, a mood that was quite clear about the massive tasks of social reconstruction that needed to happen. And so a big part of the priorities in that period was around cooperating with the new government, complementing the implementation of the RTP. And we also saw the development of a lot of advocacy type organizations that sprung up from many of the civics, but also many newer organizations. And the bulk of the money at that stage was largely coming from, historic donor relationships, and some linked to overseas development assistance and even support to some of the new work that was emerging from the new administration. We then had in the 2000s what we called here the protest era, and I must say even that is a bit of a clumsy characterization, but we'll work with it for now. And really this moment was about strengthening the democratic project through confrontation and calling for much greater accountability. But it was also a period associated with a decline in funding coming through directly from the government and the private sector. And in a way really reinforced this path dependence in the social justice sector and this massive reliance on the foreign donor community. But we also see a strong focus in the strategy of many of the donors during that period on capacity building across a wide range of sectors. There's also quite a diverse subset of organizations that are funded, even geographically. And then also, I think this period towards the latter part of the period around 2007-8 or so is not spared from the implications of the global financial crisis. Now, if we think about why this is the case, it does appear in some cases to be quite self-evident, because a lot of the organizations who fund work in the social justice sector and even in the PILO sector are funding it based on, I guess, interest flows or some, money flows that might be coming from investments in the financial and in the capital markets. So if you look at many of the foundations, be it in the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and I guess this is probably more pronounced in the United States, largely because of, I guess, the nature of the economic system and capital markets in that part of the world. A big part of the endowments, a big part of the funds that flow to the sector are intimately linked to, the level of capital market investments that are being made by many of these organizations. And so if you have a fallout, as the global financial crisis would become, that has a massive implication on the space that many of these organizations have to extend resources to the sector. And of course leads to extensive contractions, as we saw during that particular moment. And I think, many people are anticipating the same thing on the back of the sort of scarring of portfolios and the broader economy that is associated with COVID-19. We also analyze in quite significant detail, just based on the available information, what we call in the last decade, between 2011 and around 2020 or so, which we characterize as a decade that really was, defined by contestation, retreat, and consolidation. There was, massive growth in grant revenues, even to newer organizations. But if you look at the geographic locus of some of those organizations, it's largely in the urban core. And we're also seeing the reemergence of civics, social movements, alongside deepening dysfunction in our municipal and cooperative governance system. And while there have been newer players who've gone into the sector, many of the newer entrants have not made, allocations to the sector by way of grant sizes that are comparable to some of the players who have exited during the protest era and even have exited in the early stage of the last decade. And I think that's an important point to make, because what it does suggest is that as the work of many of the organizations that are on this call is expanding, there is going to be a need to diversify where that money is coming from. And that has political and even economic implications for the functioning of many of the organizations. So if we look just briefly, I guess, at some of the sort of raw numbers that we were able to glean from the annual financial statements, from donor reports, and even, I guess, trying to triangulate that with some of what is shared in grants databases, which I must add is not very, very generous or very, very abundant in availability. There's very few major donors who are sharing in a very public sense some of their grants databases, which is a theme I'll come back to a bit later. But I think we can see, even within the public interest litigation, legal aid, and the broader sort of legally focused subset of the social justice sector, that this is by no means a homogeneous space, especially in terms of the money that comes into the sector. And we've just got I guess, a small sample here. There would, of course, be many other organizations, but these are the more recognizable ones that people can pinpoint. If you woke somebody up and said, what, legal aid organization or public interest, a legal organization would you know? Some of these names that you see here would undoubtedly come up. And I want to thank some of those who we managed to speak to, who gave generously of their time and of their information sources with us. What becomes clear is that if we look at this graph, notwithstanding the size or the quanta of some of the allocations, over the last decade or so, many organizations have seen a generally positive upward trend in the allocations that have gone to their work. And of course, if you were just reading this graph, you would think, well, yeah, then there's nothing to complain about. But of course, we can't complete that story without an understanding of the social context within which they were working, and some of the demands that were being made by the broader social justice sector, both in organized form and even more spontaneous organizing that emerges to respond to specific issues. It then complicates the picture somewhat, because in many ways, many of the PILOs, a lot of their work is triggered, of course, by whatever partnerships and synergies that they might have with other organizations and struggles that are happening in the broader social justice sector. And we say in the report that while public interest litigation organizations, just by the nature of their work and the nature of the skill set of the people in the organizations, are more likely or more able in many cases to raise money because of this sort of donor cycle and the cycle of performance and accountability embedded in that, than say an organization that is in Tsofimvaba somewhere that arises out of a spontaneous response to a particular issue, and that, I guess, across different classes and across different skills profiles, might have in the composition of its members people who might not have the legal, the clerical, the administrative, and other capability that is important, as we suggest in the report, in being able to not only secure donor support, but to effectively maintain and sustain that. And a big part of that has to do with, the reciprocal performance commitments and even questions of accountability. Because this is not just free cash flow, this is not money just being thrown, but there's a reciprocal obligation to particular activities that comes with that. So, as I said, we're not going to go into the entire report, but just a few high-level things that might make for an interesting conversation and give us a few things to think about. So, as I said when we started, these three eras have, I guess, different implications. And as I said, the grant sizes in the contemporary era, when compared and when we adjust for inflation and exchange rate movements, are much smaller in size than what we might have seen maybe during the 2000s and even in the late 90s. Now, I want to maybe start off, I guess, in the comments that I'm going to make around this issue of capacity and capability. So many of the organizations that are on this call, by the nature of the work that they do, tend to be relatively much better capacitated than, say, as I said, a civic organization or a social movement that arises in a very spontaneous fashion, determined by its own social conditions. And in many ways, that becomes a binding constraint to their ability to expand and to grow, in a way that allows them to not only attract much larger funding flows to those organizations, but allows them, to expand the scale and the scope of the work that they do. So if you take, for instance, a Section 27 is a different organization to an advice office, or an advice office that might not be linked to a broader national coalition. Yet, when we think about this, how would we sort of think and formulate what we might think of as the evolutionary journey of that organization, from just being, an organization that is staffed by paralegals who are dealing with day-to-day legal issues, but to an organization whose scope of work is much wider and is able to cover much more areas of work that are relevant to the legal challenges or even social legal challenges that an organization might face. And one of the ways to do this is to make sure that at a broader ecosystem level, there is a need to create this pooled resource of not only proposal development capability and organizational and business development support, but even pooling of the capacity to do evaluatory work that is critical to getting successive waves of funding and support. But also the capability that allows us to be able to account and to report for the resources. And one way to do this is to think around how do we use local resources, in particular those who might have undergraduate qualifications, might be unemployed, who with some onboarding training and through a digital and web-based interface would be able to serve as a shared pool of administrators, accountants, fundraisers, and all of these support measures that would serve as a basis for some shared service framework within the sector that organizations can tap into. And of course, there would have to be thresholds around how big an organization is, what type of work it does, the resources that it manages. But the idea is to say the task of an organization in some of these cases, or the leaders of the organization, are good at what they do. They're good at organizing communities, they're good at agitating, but in some cases, they might not necessarily be good at being able to do the books or being able to, go into all of the work that's needed to interface and to engage with fundraisers. And I think the sector as a whole needs to think a bit differently around, how do we create this shared resource that the sector can tap into on a need basis and as and when they require some of that type of support. The second element, of course, is around corporations. Okay, I don't know. Yeah. The second area is around, funding from corporations in South Africa. And in the report, we talk about the Zuma must fall moment as a critical inflection moment. In this sense, and we can have a debate around, I guess, the sort of political utility of that moment. But in a sense, what you saw during that moment was a commonality of intent between corporate South Africa and the broader and more recognizable organizations in the social justice sector. And the key question mark is, what did the social justice sector get in return from its participation on a common platform with particular organizations and even corporations who were standing instead and even protesting during that particular moment. And we argue in the report that if you look at the weighted average returns, and even the market capitalization of many of the listed companies, that spiked during that moment. But one would argue whether or not that's been reciprocated with a intent and even a commitment to continue to support the sector, not in this sort of self-selecting type of way corporations often do it. And I think Fatima was talking to this, that, in many cases, corporations are more interested in direct welfare type work, more interested in health, education type work, rather than the work agitationally and in the advocacy front that is critical to strengthening our democracy. And in a way, what is needed is really an explicit and a very reciprocal compact between South African corporations and the social justice sector, where we're able to link financial and in-kind support to critical financial and real economy variables. So if we had done this in the Zuma must fall moment, there would have been a reciprocal commitment that says, on the back of whatever windfalls and value that you are able to get as the corporate sector, and you might peg that, I'm quite reluctant to peg that to financial metrics because there's all manner of other sentiment-related things that drive that. But we have to peg it to certain things that are critical to the functioning and the operational environment of these firms that tie them into a commitment to funding the sector as a whole rather than very specific and self-selected organizations. And it might be profitability, might be weighted average changes in the market cap of listed firms, or it might even be certain targets that corporate South Africa itself makes over a long period of time to the social justice sector.
The other element to interrupt.
Yeah, sure.
We just got about 4 minutes left.
Okay, let me just rush through it then.
Yeah.
So I think the other element, of course, is this possibility of creating a donor-led and matched capital pool that is around matching all of the contributions that could be drawn from not only just the corporate ecosystem, but even some of the skills development and even a broad-based Black economic empowerment ecosystem. We do a lot of capacity building. We do a lot of acquisition of assets. We do a lot of organizational capacity type work in the sector. But none of that work is in any meaningful way resourced through some of the sector education and training authorities that are ideally set up for that purpose. Then, of course, the other element that I think is critical to the self-introspection of the sector is how are we thinking about the budgets and the allocations that we're making as a catalyst for local economic development? There's nothing more unsettling than having a situation where, much of the donor funds...
Sorry, colleagues, please mute your... Margaret, if you could just mute yourself. Margaret Fish, please mute yourself. Sorry about that, Ayabanga.
Sure, no worries. So the one element, of course, is to see a lot of the donor funding as a catalyst for local economic development. And one of the recommendations we make is that the donor ecosystem could consider a pilot program with its existing partner network that encourages them to source services and products from local producers and entrepreneurs. Now, what do I mean by this? Instead of having a convening at a listed, hospitality players' premises, Sun International, Tsoko San, and all of these other players, I hate to sort of pinpoint them, there should be scope for us to really try and challenge ourselves and be a bit more creative around where we locate the activities, who are some of the suppliers that potentially benefit from things like travel, catering, hospitality and accommodation, types of spending, and all of the other spending areas that are critical to the functioning of this sector, and in particular, the work of public interest litigation organizations. And how do we do that in a way that allows us to really complement some of the initiatives that are underway to try and strengthen, informal sector and also to strengthen small and medium-sized enterprises, in particular those led by women. And then I think the last one, which is an element that we're really hoping to take forward, and maybe Fatima can say a bit more about this, is to really look inward. A lot of the organizations who we reached out to didn't want to share their information. A lot of the organizations, for all manner of reasons, were unable to share the information. And in some instances, we're really not interested in participating in the study, but would be interested in the insights that come out from the study. And what that indicates is not just an individual level issue, but what it indicates is a systemic issue where there is no information sharing within the donor ecosystem, let alone within or between donors and some of the organizations in the broader social justice sector. And I would add, even in some of the public interest litigation organizations we try to reach out to. And there's a big question mark around how do we agitate and call for transparency in other spaces when we don't hold ourselves to the same standard in terms of sharing the information around where our money is coming from, in instances where it's ideal to do so. And you can even share it on an anonymized basis, but the idea is that there has to be some line of sight for ecosystem actors around who is contributing to what space, where are the allocations happening, so that there isn't a duplication of functions and all of the money ends up in Johannesburg and Cape Town. But we're able to have a system-wide and a national level understanding of, one, the resources in the sector, where those resources are allocated, where the strategic areas of priority are. And I think that then assists many organizations who are trying to make sure that their work is resourced and underwritten in a way that is sustainable, to effectively know where areas of strategic alignment are and where their outreach should ideally be. And I think we make some examples in the report of grants databases and some of the information that would be really, really helpful. And it's really about saying, in a particular year, these are the organizations we've supported, informed by our strategic focus on these areas. And that's a critical part, really, in strengthening the sector, but also in ensuring that we're able to really hold ourselves to the same standards that we agitate and advocate for. So let me pause there. And once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present some of this work. And I'd encourage comrades to go and see the report as well.
Ayabonga, thank you so much for that input. I found it absolutely interesting and mind-boggling at the same time, and how this whole thing works. And I think through Fatima, we are going to have a donor convening soon with organizations in the sector, and I think it'll be mighty useful if you could come there, and then we could give more time, and engage on your input a bit further, because half an hour just doesn't do justice to the work that you've done. But thank you very much. Fatima, just over to you for a few minutes, and then we'll close.
I think just the first point from our side, the priority is to get a shared donor database together, and that is harder than you can imagine. So the idea is that we all, at the minimum, put in the public domain who we fund and what we fund them, the amounts of money that we're giving to organizations. On the rate part, it's not justifiable that these things are secrets. So we are taking the conversation into the donor room, and hopefully, and we are mindful of the fact that some of the decision making for some of these donors are not located in South Africa. It's located somewhere else. So we are cognizant of the fact that it's more difficult for others. We're a South African philanthropy, and so we convince our board, and things get done. It's easier for us. But we do think there should be a set of non-negotiables if we are to not contradict the values that we purport to be fighting for in the world. And so I think that is a small enough ask. We are engaging our colleagues on that side, and IA is helping with that. My suggestion again, Nelson, is that on the sector side, that the organizations have a really strategic think about what the nature of the conversation is and what the priorities are. And really, again, in relation to the question posed by Robin, to have a clear vision on what it is what the asks are, because I did facilitate our conversation considerably. But thank you to Paul for the opportunity. This is a very important conversation. I've enjoyed it. I wish it was more interactive, but I'm sure it's the start of many to come. Yeah.
Fatima, thank you so much, and thank you, Toko and Ayabonga, for this engaging session. Like you said, I think it's there are a lot of conversations that are happening on the sidelines, and we need to bring those conversations into the center, and then we can move forward from there. But we will be in touch with you. There is a donor convening group within the PILG, and we will take it from there. But thank you so much to the three of you for joining us, and thank you for all the guests and colleagues that have stayed right till the end. And I'm just going to hand over to Shyam, who will do the closing remarks. Shyam.